All right. So in yesterday's lecture, we discussed the era of good feelings and the presidency of James Monroe after the War of 1812. We talked about the fact that when the war was over, because the Federalists in New England had met at the Hartford Convention, once again debating seceding from the Union and bailing on the United States before they lost the war, those actions had essentially led to the death of the Federalist Party. And so when War of 1812 was over and the United States had survived, as we move forward, the Federalist Party was dead effectively, and the Republican Party became the only political party in America at the time. And so this is the presidency of James Monroe is often referred to as that era of good feelings, the only brief period in American history where there was no second political party. There was only one political party, the Republicans. And we talked yesterday about the fact that they were able to accomplish quite a bit during that era of good feelings under James Monroe. They built the first national roads. They acquired Florida through the Adams-Onis Treaty. We talked about establishing America's official foreign policy with the Monroe Doctrine, and a lot of good things happened. But where we left off yesterday, at the end of Monroe's presidency, following keeping with the tradition at the time, he served two full terms as president. In 1824, he decided to step down. And so what we see happen as a result is in the election of 1824, it's the first election where there was only one political party, the Republicans, and at this point, the Republican Party had become somewhat corrupt. A number of different factions had divided into the party, and as well, you see multiple candidates from the same political party. Anytime you see more than two candidates for the presidency, that creates problematic situations where it could cause an issue in the election. And so in the election of 1824, as we talked about this yesterday, we talked about the major candidates. You start with John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams. He had served as Secretary of State under James Monroe. He was a party favorite. He was an experienced politician. He's the person that everybody assumed would be the next president. The political party, the Republican Party, wanted John Quincy Adams. However, the most popular candidate at the time, though, was actually Andrew Jackson, the hero of the War of 1812, the hero of New Orleans, the hero of the Indian Wars down with the Seminoles. And by this point in time, Andrew Jackson is very popular with the common person, but he's not necessarily popular with the political party, the Republican Party. And then you throw in two more candidates, Henry Clay and William Crawford. Henry Clay was an experienced statesman from the South, from Kentucky. If Andrew Jackson hadn't been the candidate in the election of 1824, Henry Clay very may well have been the next president of the United States. However, what we see is with four candidates in that election, they start to fracture the electorate. And so when you get to the results of the election of 1824, you have a very interesting scenario. In this particular situation, Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote and he wins the Electoral College. But here's the problem. If you remember earlier on when we talked about the Constitution, in order to become president of the United States, you have to win more than half of the votes in the Electoral College. And when you take a look at the election of 1824, the problem for Andrew Jackson is that he only acquired 38% of the Electoral College votes. He had more votes than John Quincy Adams. He had more votes than Henry Clay and William Crawford, but he didn't have the required number to become president of the United States outright. And so what happened in the election of 1824 is anytime that you don't have a candidate win the required number of Electoral College votes, the House of Representatives selects the president for us. And in this particular case, the odd man out who had finished fourth in this election was Henry Clay, a leader in the House of Representatives. Now remember, Henry Clay and the established Republican Party do not like Andrew Jackson. And so as a result, what we saw happen in the election of 1824 is when the election results went to the House of Representatives, Henry Clay used his influence and struck a deal with John Quincy Adams. In exchange for Henry Clay's support, and in exchange for delivering the House of Representatives, Henry Clay was able to use that influence to get John Quincy Adams elected president of the United States. And the first thing that John Quincy Adams did in turn was he nominated Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. Remember, at that time, the Secretary of State was the position that was the inside track to the presidency. So by naming Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams was effectively naming his successor after his term as president would be over. And so we call this deal struck between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams as the corrupt bargain, because what most people believe happened is that they actually stole the election of 1824. They stole the presidency from Andrew Jackson. He's the first president in American history, the first person in American history to win the Electoral College, win the popular vote, and still did not become president of the United States. Now, in typical Jacksonian fashion, he became furious with the results, became furious with the decision, and Jackson left the Republican Party to form his own political party. And so this is where we get the birth of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, as we know it today, was founded by Andrew Jackson and his followers as a result of the corrupt bargain of 1824. He felt that he had been robbed of the presidency, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests that he probably was. And immediately during the presidency of John Quincy Adams, Jackson immediately began his campaign to run again. And so throughout those 4 years, Andrew Jackson was collecting support, collecting a number of different avenues to begin this Democratic Party, to create a rival party to the Republican Party. And so when we hit the election of 1828, just 4 years later, your two major candidates now are John Quincy Adams running for re-election and Andrew Jackson and his new Democratic Party. And as a result of this, Andrew Jackson is incredibly popular with the people. He wins in a landslide, and he starts to collect a lot of that support. A lot of those old Republicans that had been with Thomas Jefferson. You know, when we first talked about the political parties, when we talked about the original political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson, remember, the Republicans were the party of the common man. They were the party of poor farmers in the South and in the frontiers. Well, these are the same people that are appealing to Andrew Jackson now. And so with that large segment of the population in his back pocket, Andrew Jackson wins a large landslide, sweeping victory, carries this new Democratic Party into all facets of of government. And this actually becomes the death of the Republican Party. And so what we see is Andrew Jackson assumes the presidency. And Andrew Jackson, while we had talked about earlier Thomas Jefferson being viewed as the people's president, and the fact that it was small-time farmers and people in the frontier that supported Thomas Jefferson, let's keep in mind that Thomas Jefferson was a wealthy member of the aristocracy in Virginia. He was a plantation owner. He was somebody who had served as a representative to France and had traveled the world. Thomas Jefferson didn't have a lot in common with the average person, even though he represented the average person. Andrew Jackson is the first president of the United States who genuinely has the feel of being an average American. He doesn't come from a wealthy upper class. He was a poor orphan from Tennessee who had fought in the Revolution when he was 14 years old, had been captured by the British, was not formally educated. His family had died. He had brought himself up by his own bootstraps, so to speak, and through a hard, rough reputation and hard work and self-education and ingenuity, he had become president of the United States. Has the nickname Old Hickory because his men believed how tough he was and all that stuff. And this endears him to the average American. And so Andrew Jackson and his newly formed Democratic Party become the party of the common man. And they start to institute changes in the American government and the political system, changes that still exist to this day. For example, they felt that the party shouldn't just pick your candidates for you. The people should have a say. And so therefore, they were the first political party to hold conventions, where at the convention, party leaders have to gain support in order to select their candidates for the people. They eliminated the property requirement for voting, which, if you think about it, really makes sense. If you're Andrew Jackson and you are the hero of the common man, do you want the average person voting? And the answer is yes. Yes, you do. And so therefore, if you take a look back through the past, initially in the United States, in order to be a voter, you had to be a white male who owned property. And we discussed how early on the reason why is because they wanted more educated people to be the voters. Well, Andrew Jackson's not necessarily so concerned about that. He's more concerned about representing the average American. And so Andrew Jackson says, you know, the average American may not be as educated, they may not be as wealthy if they don't have property, but they should still have a vote. And the reason Andrew Jackson believed this is because those types of people were more inclined to vote for him. And so therefore, this is how he's building his electorate. He's building his support. He's building this massive Democratic Party that eventually wiped out the Republican Party. Now, not everyone in America loved Andrew Jackson. There was plenty of enemies of Andrew Jackson, plenty of people who disagreed with his policies, plenty of people who disagreed with a lot of what he was trying to do at the time. And so the second political party that is formed to oppose Andrew Jackson and his Democrats is the Whig Party. And so what you see is, if we're taking a look real quick as we go back through history there, the first two political parties were the Federalists and the Republicans, the Thomas Jefferson Republicans. After the War of 1812, the Federalist Party died. We have that period, that era of good feelings where it's mostly the Republican Party. That is replaced. Then after that era of good feelings, Andrew Jackson creates the Democratic Party. He wins in a wide sweeping election, becomes the people's president. The Republicans under Thomas Jefferson died, but they were replaced by the Whig Party. And at this point, those are your two major prominent political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs.